All right, hello again, everyone. It's really good to be with you guys as always. Today, we're just continuing with our course by getting to the second of our three-lecture series, three-lecture unit on the Japanese religious traditions. And again, those are Shinto and the various sects of Japanese Buddhism. So this is the second of three installments. We started last time by just getting into a general introduction of these traditions, as well as their origins and their historical development. We also started to review the aspects of the divine that are found in the traditions, but we didn't quite finish that section. So we got as far as the review of aspects of the divine in the Shinto tradition, but we still have a little to say more about the aspects of the divine that characterize the Japanese schools of Buddhist thought. So today we're going to start with that first, and then after we finish with aspects of the divine that are found in Japanese Buddhism, we will move on to discuss a few other important elements of the Japanese traditions. In particular, we'll talk about, so I'm just listing here in the chat area the topics of today's meeting. So okay, so we'll finish out the course unit on Japanese aspects of the divine and Japanese Buddhism as opposed to the Shinto. And then it's going to be sacred texts, the important sacred texts and writings that are crucial to understanding both Shinto and various sects of Buddhism in Japan. Then we will move on and talk about the sacred people, important, notable human beings that are historically significant in both of these different Japanese religious traditions. And then the ethical principles. That's how we'll kind of cap off today's material. The ethical principles that are important to the practice of these religions and also to just Japanese culture and identity. Okay, so those are our major points to focus on today. Good, so let's just then get right into it and wrap up our discussion of aspects of the divine that are seen in the Japanese traditions by examining aspects of the divine in Japanese Buddhism. So Japanese Buddhism generally follows the Mahayana school of Buddhism. So we've learned about that a little bit before, just a couple of pointers to remember. In Mahayana Buddhism, there's one feature of it is that there's a number of sacred semi-divine beings that are known as celestial Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. These are considered to be enlightened beings who delay their achievement of nirvana in order to assist others on their own path to nirvana. And they are said to, kind of reside in some celestial realm where they can intervene into the world from that realm. They can answer prayers, they can confer blessings, they can extend grace to people or give them good luck. So they reside in some kind of celestial domain. People can sort of pray to them as though gods, but they are just enlightened human beings that have achieved enlightenment, and they're holding off just slightly on their final nirvana where they will no longer exist so that they can act as these sources of grace and blessings to current day Buddhist followers and help them on their path. The Japanese term for the celestial Buddhas is Butsu. So here we go, just a little terminology. And the term for Bodhisattva, similar, is let me get that, Bosatsu, yeah. Okay, so one of those celestial Buddhas or Bodhisattvas is known as either Butsu or Bosatsu. And three especially important celestial Buddhas in the Japanese tradition are the Butsu Amida. Amida, we've talked about a few times. This is the same as in Sanskrit, Amitabha, the Buddha of light. In Japanese, it's Amida. There's so getting my notes here. Yeah, that's the one that presides over the Pure Land. We'll talk a little bit more about Pure Land Buddhism today, but that's one of the prevailing sects of Buddhism in Japan. There's also Kannon and Jizo, so two other celestial Buddhas or Butsus. Okay, Kannon, Jizo. Kannon is the Japanese name for the Chinese bodhisattva Ganyin. So Kannon is just a Japanese way of pronouncing and articulating this, sometimes mentioned in both Chinese and Indian Buddhism. Ganyin. And Ganyin is itself derived from the Indian bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara. Okay, so just different names for the same celestial bodhisattva figure, or Butsu, if you like. Kannon is the Japanese name that's we're focused on now, but as we trace its lineage back, it started as Avalokiteshvara in the Indian Sanskrit Buddhist tradition. Then, as it was adapted for Chinese culture, it became Ganyin. And then, as it spreads to other communities, it's known in Japan as Kannon. So, sometimes Kannon is depicted as male, sometimes depicted as female. So there's kind of like a gender ambiguity with him or them. And it's known as the Busatsu that you petition to for forgiveness or mercy. So if you want to be forgiven for some bad deed, or you would like to have grace bestowed on you and mercy for some transgression, then you would turn your attention towards petitioning Kannon. Temples to Kannon are widespread in Japanese communities throughout the country, and it's sometimes called Kannon of the Thousand Arms. So sometimes this Bosatsu is referred to Kannon of the Thousand Arms to signify their unlimited compassion and grace that they can give to their followers. So all these arms are supposed to be symbolic or representative of power, and since this is such a compassionate deity, the power is used to benefit other people. Jizo, as we've mentioned their name there, is another Bosatsu whose focus is primarily on children. So that's interesting. Jizo is focused on children, especially those that have tragically died. Small temples to Jizo called Jizo-yas. So let's just put that term in here. Jizo-yas are these little temples to the Butsu Jizo, and they're also widespread in Japan. They often feature images of Jizo wearing a red scarf and an article of clothing from a child that has tragically deceased. Jizo, aside from their connection with the protection of children and safeguard of the young, is believed to more broadly speak to or be the protector of the innocent and all those who suffer. Some say that he can help lead damned souls out of hell. The Japanese term for a hellish domain in the underworld or afterlife is Jikobu. So we'll talk more about that when we get to death in the afterlife in the next lesson. But anyway, yeah, so some say that Jizo can help lead damned souls out of hell and to the Pure Land, where they can then make progress towards their salvation and nirvana. Now, Shinto believers have the supernatural kami. Buddhists have butsu and bosatsu. But in the way that people practice these religions in Japan, the distinctions between kami and butsu and bosatsu are kind of blurry. The two traditions in Japan have considerable overlapping features, and you can believe in both kami and bosatsu with no contradiction. That's seen generally as similar and with similar roles in both faiths. So kami and butsu, busatsu, they serve similar roles, and there's a lot of bleeding into one another in terms of how they're understood in the Japanese cultural identity. So for example, bosatsu are worshipped as kami by some people, and sometimes people worship kami as bosatsu vice versa. So, there's a sort of permeable barrier between the two of them, and they cross-pollinate, if you want to use a metaphor. Some human beings have been added to the pantheon of Japanese deities. For example, if they had a major impact in society or in history. One of those is a man named Tenjin. So let me tell you about this man that became, classified as a deity after his death. He lived from 845 to 903 ACE. Okay, and regarding Tenjin, let me tell you about his life a little bit. In his life, he was a wise scholar and also was a government officer. At the peak of his career, though, he was having such success that he had certain colleagues that were jealous of him. So they hatched a plot. They conspired together to falsely accuse him of misconduct. And because of that allegation, he was banished and exiled from his hometown. After he died, a series of, unfortunate events befell the region that he was from. So, for example, the city that was his hometown after he died was afflicted by fires and diseases, pestilence that had come through. And it was believed that this was punishment for how they had treated Tenjin, because of this accusation that forced him into exile. So to appease his spirit, a shrine was built to his kami, to his spirit. And this is the Kitano Temmango shrine. Yeah, in the chat. Okay, the Kitano Temmango shrine is built in honor of Tenjin. And that's still considered one of the most important Shinto shrines in the city of Kyoto, where it's located. The legends say that after they built the shrine, the conditions immediately improved in the lands where there were all these kind of calamities and disasters happening. So in this way, Tenjin becomes a notable member of the Shinto pantheon, revered throughout Japan. One of the things that he's supposed to be capable of helping you with is that he helps people in educational endeavors. So if you're a student and you need to take a big test and you want to do well, you would pray to or worship Tenjin. Or if you're a scholar doing research on like a big important academic research project, then again, you might appeal to him. He's a scholarly individual, so that's part of his divine characteristic now that he's in the pantheon of the gods. Some call him the divine bureaucrat because of his divine nature, but also his kind of systematic and intellectual way of approaching life. Other deities with historical roots are Meiji, the emperor of the early 20th century, who was then added to the pantheon after his own death. But okay, that gives us, I guess, a good enough sense of the different sacred people that we talked about here, right? Yeah, that's the current topic. Yes. So, oh no, I meant to say aspects of the divine. Thank you, guys. So now our discussion of the aspects of the divine in both Shinto and Japanese Buddhism is complete. The next subject is the sacred texts and writings of the Japanese traditions. Yeah, I confused my notes for one moment because I have two sets of notes here. We will definitely get to the sacred persons just after this. But anyway, we're now focused on the sacred texts, everybody, sacred texts. So there's two very important sacred texts. The two most sacred and oldest written texts of the Shinto tradition are these two major works from the early 8th century ACE. That is the year from 700 to 800 ACE. In that century, we see the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki emerge. So in 712 ACE, it's the Kojiki. And the Nihon Shoki, that is from 720 ACE, 8 years later. Okay. Yeah, so again, within the Japanese indigenous religion of Shinto, there are two sacred texts of fundamental importance. They both come in the 8th century during the Nara period, just so that we don't forget that time period. The Nara period in Japan's history is from 710 to 794 ACE. Okay. Now, these texts are sacred, but they're sacred not in the sense of being divinely revealed by God to, like, say, a prophet. So that's a difference that they have from, say, like the Bible, the Christian Bible, or the Quran, which are said to be, a divinely revealed message. So basically written in the voice of God. But these texts are not that way. They're considered to be just important epic historical genealogies that extend way back into early prehistory, and they try to trace the lineage of living rulers in various Japanese clans way back to these deities that were spoken of in these mythical or fabled legendary stories of those genealogies. So they're kind of like not the divine revealed word of God, but rather chronicles of a fabled history and genealogy of the imperial line. Kojiki, the word, if it's literally interpreted, means record of ancient matters, and it is the oldest text that is written in Japanese. As I told you guys earlier in these lessons, Japan was not literate, or at least semi-literate, until the arrival of Buddhism, when scholars and aristocrats wanted to be able to read the scriptures that were coming from Chinese missionaries that were Buddhist. So that leads to the development of the Japanese characters and symbols of Japan's language. So the first written text in the kind of newly formed Japanese language, at least that has survived through the ages, is the Kojiki. It was compiled, arranged, and edited by Ono Yasumaro in 712 ACE. So let me make sure that you got his name. Ono Yasumaro, he compiled the Kojiki. So, Record of Ancient Matters, compiled by Ono Yasumaro, arranged in 712 ACE. He was a scholar, and he derived it from earlier sources. Some of those earlier sources that he used were written. Many of those have since been lost. So some of them were like older tracts that had been written in Chinese, and others were transmitted orally throughout the ages. So the type of genealogy that this book represents is, again, linking powerful clans of the current day. Those are uji in Japan. So linking these powerful uji to a divine being in the past, the divine kami. And again, we see a pattern here which links secular power to divine power. There was an interest in trying to justify and give grounding to the current political leadership and authorities with some kind of divine, fundamentals and basis. The Kojiki is a set of genealogies, family histories of the powerful uji that were at the center of Japanese politics in this Nara period of the 8th century. The most important of these clans was the imperial clan known as the Yamato clan. So again, there's this interesting effort to tie divine and earthly authority in the way the Kojiki traces the history of the uji back to a divine source. Now, the most important was the Yamato clan. During the 8th century, when it was being written, Japan was being heavily influenced by the culture and traditions of China. In China, there had long been a genre of writing known as the imperial chronicle, and the function of the imperial chronicle would be to establish the legitimacy of the ruling authorities and their divine right to rule. So they borrowed from aspects of Chinese culture. That's like the mother civilization of East Asia, and from their genre of the imperial chronicle intended to legitimize the ruling dynasty, we get this Japanese text known as the Kojiki. The imperial chronicle seeks to establish the supremacy and the fitness to rule of those in power. And in the Japanese case, this chronicle was commissioned by the imperial court to construct a record that would give, divine right to rule for the ruling Yamato clan. So inspired by the Chinese historical example of these imperial chronicles, the Yamato court commissions Ono to compile this Japanese chronicle to establish the righteous supremacy of their uji. The beginning of the Kojiki does this with the Shinto origin story of the creation of the Japanese islands by those divine kami that we talked about in the last lecture, Izanagi and Izanami, and the birth of the sun goddess Amaterasu, and how she is linked to her descendant Jimmu, who's the first emperor. So again, the beginning of the Kojiki discusses the epic cosmology that begins the world, the story of Izanagi and Izanami giving birth to the Japanese archipelago. The other major religious tradition of Japan is Buddhism. But let me make sure I haven't missed any of these notes that I've got for you. Yeah. Yeah, the second most, no, actually, I don't want to talk about the Buddhist stuff just yet. Hold that thought for a second. I want to continue saying a little bit more about the other major text that we spoke of above, the Nihon Shoki. So the second most central text in the Shinto religion is the Nihon Shoki. That was, as you can see by the dates, written 8 years after the Kojiki, and it's considered to be a sort of correction to the Kojiki. Here's the issue that some people in the high power centers of Japan wanted to correct. Some within those Japanese clans at the time appreciated the Kojiki, but they thought, it's not putting enough emphasis on the current leadership of Japan. It places greater emphasis on the history of the imperial clan, and especially the primordial early days where these divine beings kind of gave rise to the earth and to Japan itself. So they wanted to have another version, basically, that more specifically focused on the contributions and stories of the current day clans that were at that time ruling. So the court commissioned a group of scholars to produce another chronicle to fix this perceived problem, and that's what became the Nihon Shoki. Nihon Shoki just means Chronicles of Japan. The Kojiki, which came before it, is much more straightforward and coherent as a narrative compared to the Nihon Shoki. The Nihon Shoki was written from multiple perspectives, giving different accounts of mythical events for each of the several major clans. So, the several major clans that existed all kind of wanted to have their little piece of the pie in terms of having some epic historical genealogy that chronicles, how they came to exist from some fabled, early ancient past presided over by gods. So by creating all these different accounts from different perspectives of each clan, it causes the book to have less cohesion. In some cases, it's a jumble of inconsistencies, and sometimes it's repetitive, but it still remains a vital and diverse body of stories and legends that do give a sense of the diversity of ancient Shinto mythology. And there's a few other important Shinto texts. One is the Man-yoshu, just to mention another one. So the Man-yoshu comes from 760 ACE. You see like a flowering of kind of Shinto literature in that 8th century. The Man-yoshu is just a massive anthology of poetry with religious and mythical themes. Okay. So, big book of religious and legendary poems. There's also the Fudoki. This comes from 713 ACE again. And that is referred to as provincial chronicles. They tell of local legends. So So instead of being an epic story that accounts for the entire Japanese archipelago, the Fudoki tells about local legends and kami that are more specifically rooted in villages and provinces that are of smaller geographic jurisdiction than the whole country. So there's also another book, the Engishiki, that's from the late 10th century ACE, which just has a lot of ritual prayers that are used in public ceremonies and religious festivals. So just to mention that as well. Book of prayers that are used in public rites and religious ceremonies. Now, I also want to mention some of the important sacred writings in the Japanese Buddhist tradition. Some of these we've mentioned in our earlier meetings on Buddhism in either the Indian or Chinese context, so I won't spend a ton of time talking about them because I don't want to be too repetitive, but I still want to put them into the Japanese context. So the other major religious tradition of Japan is obviously Buddhism, and a major Japanese Buddhist text is the Lotus Sutra. So we're talking about sacred texts, so we got to circle back quickly to the Lotus Sutra, just to remind ourselves of its major messages and how they were imported into Japanese culture too. The central idea of the Lotus Sutra is that all life contains Buddha nature to some extent, to some degree. Buddha nature is the capacity for compassion and the peace of having renounced desires, having eliminated your desires. The way to your nirvana, to your salvation, is to realize the Buddha nature that's within you. This brand of Japanese Buddhism, coming from the Lotus Sutra, focuses on a positively oriented message. It says that we are at our core good, and we just have to realize this good inner essence within our human nature. It's interesting because, different religions have different views about what basic human nature is. In the Christian tradition, human nature has been corrupted by the fall of man in the Garden of Eden. In Islam, there's no such idea of original sin. In Judaism, they say that we have an impulse to do good and an impulse to do bad, and that we're perpetually kind of struggling between them. And in some Buddhist doctrines anyway, in some sects, they say that we're fundamentally good, like in this version of Mahayana Buddhism that follows the Lotus Sutra. So a little more on the Buddhist sacred texts. The all-important Lotus Sutra came to Japan with Buddhist missionaries in the mid-6th century ACE, around 550 ACE. Let me read a little piece of the textbook on that, just to add to our insight. The Lotus Sutra, as it says in the book, the central thesis of the Lotus Sutra is that all life contains to a lesser or greater degree Buddha nature. This can be understood as the capacity for an all-embracing compassion, coupled with the serenity that comes from having renounced all desire. Salvation is only possible if your Buddha nature can be fully realized, and to achieve this, the worshiper must be devoted to a life of prayer and meditation, and seek the help of a variety of bodhisattvas. The realization of Buddha nature brings the devotee closer to the ultimate goal, nirvana, permanent release from the endless cycle of death and rebirth. Okay. Okay. Next in importance in Buddhist Japanese tradition is the Sun Sutra. So the Sun Sutra. The Sun Sutra is central to the Shingon sect of Buddhism that was brought to Japan by Kobo Daishi in the early 9th century. And its major message is that the whole universe came from the Sun Buddha, whose name is Vairochana. And like the Lotus Sutra, it urges us to realize our Buddha nature, but it says that the best route to that salvation is by gaining divine knowledge and studying Buddhist texts rather than just devotion to a bosatsu or butsu. So with that, I guess we're ready to move on to the next topic, which is the sacred persons that are significant to the Japanese traditions. The most important figures in the Shinto tradition are scholars like Yasumaru, who edited the Kojiki, Ono Yasumaru that I just mentioned, and another important figure is Motoori Norinaga. So here we go. So Motoori Norinaga, he lived from 1730 to 1801. And let me just tell you about his impact and his influence. So he's primarily responsible for a great revival of Shinto in Japanese culture that happened in the late 1700s. It's known as this movement, the revival of Shinto, and bringing it back to the forefront of Japanese culture in his lifetime. That has been known as the Kokugaku. And that just means national learning movement. But again, the quote-unquote national learning movement is really just a revival of Shinto religious practice and belief in Japan. Before focusing on the study of Japanese Shinto classics of the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki, Motoori Norinaga studied medicine. So he started off studying medicine. he kind of wanted to move into a different realm, and he then focused on the study of the Japanese Shinto classics. And he really got so invested in the study of them and the practice of their principles that he believed that it kind of led to a version of Japanese nationalism in his mind. He thought that Japanese national identity is essentially connected to the ancient Shinto texts. So he ended up writing a 44-volume masterpiece that tries to interpret the Kojiki, which is known as Kojiki Den. That's his book, the Kojiki Den, written by Motoori Norinaga, and that just means interpretation Kojiki. So that, and by the way, that's from 1798. Just putting the date there. Yeah, and he was opposed to Chinese influence, and he was opposed to Buddhism as not being originally rooted in Japan. He wanted Japanese people to see the unique character of their own traditions and culture. And so because of his influence, partially because of his influence, there was a backlash against both Chinese and Buddhism and Chinese culture as it relates to Japan itself. So for a few generations after his life, there was kind of this like anti-Buddhist, anti-Chinese sentiment that prevailed. And one reason for that is because he argued so passionately that it's all about Shinto in Japan, and it's all about our indigenous traditions. We shouldn't be just assimilating the cultural and religious views of outsiders. There are perhaps a greater number of notable quote-unquote sacred persons in the Japanese Buddhist tradition than in the Shinto tradition. So we've talked now about Norinaga and Yasumaro. So in the Kamakura era, which spans from 1185 to 1333, there were several important Japanese Buddhist figures who trained at the Tendai Temple complex in Mount Hai. So let me make sure you know the Kamakura era dates. Okay, so dates of the Kamakura era. That's 1185 to 1333. Okay, and during this time, there emerged several very important Japanese Buddhist figures that trained at the Tendai Temple complex on Mount Hai. So okay, so the Tendai Buddhist Temple complex on Mount Hai is like a sort of major training ground, school, seminary, where people will go to just have a life of study and training in Buddhist doctrines and beliefs. So one of the people who emerged from the Tendai complex to become a prominent Japanese Buddhist figure is Honen. So here we have a man that's important to Japanese Buddhism's history, Honen, who lived from 1133 to 1212 ACE. Honen. So he is a founder of the Pure Land sect of Buddhism in Japan, which in its Japanese name is, let me get the right name. Yeah. Oh yes, Jodoshu. It's Pure Land, you know, the English translation of it. So sometimes the Japanese originals escape me unless I see my notes. But Jodoshu is Pure Land Buddhism, and its Japanese variant is kind of primarily due to the efforts of Honen. So Honen believed that the world was chaotic and human beings were too inherently wicked to achieve salvation or nirvana on their own. Part of the reason that he believed that was because he's living during a time where there were civil wars, and since that chaotic status quo existed, he thought we're never going to get to salvation on our own. Even if we tried our hardest, even if we spent all our life meditating, practicing ethical behavior, trying to eliminate our desires, he thought the world is just too distracting, chaotic, and human beings are too inherently conflicted and unethical in the general case, that we kind of have to rely on the mercy of Busatsu to deliver us to grace. So he believed that we have to rely on the mercy of Amida Buddha. Amida is the Buddha of light, Amitabha in the Sanskrit Indian original way of saying it. And he said you have to appeal to the mercy of this celestial Buddha. If you're devoted to him, then maybe you'll be reborn in the Pure Land with him. And when you're reborn in the Pure Land, then you have kind of a nicer opportunity to pursue your own nirvana because it's pure, it's nice, it's good, it's just, it's free from the wickedness and distraction and chaos of the world. They say that this arrival into the Pure Land could be achieved through ritual chanting and a specific chant that's called the Nembutsu. So I want to tell you about the Nembutsu. It's this phrase. Let me say it first in Japanese. Namu Abida Butsu. And what that means is, I'll put that in parentheses after the Japanese phrase. It just means I put my faith in Amida Buddha. Okay, so in Pure Land Buddhism, once again, people that follow this tradition think that we're all seeking nirvana, we're seeking enlightenment, we want to, escape samsara. But some say, like for example, Honen believed that we are just not going to get there on our own. It's too hard. The obstacles to it are too difficult. So the only way it's going to really probably happen is if we are assisted by grace given to us by the Buddha of light, Amida Buddha. And one way to win the grace and favor of Amida Buddha is to chant at auspicious times this statement that says Namu Amida Butsu. That's the Nembutsu, and it simply means I put my faith in Amida Buddha. Notice that that's not completely unlike certain Christian doctrines of salvation through faith alone. Like you need God's grace, and as long as you believe in him, then even if you haven't been perfect morally or whatever, you might win salvation because God is going to give grace to his believers. So it's a similar concept seen both in this sect of Japanese Buddhism and then also in certain of other like Abrahamic traditions. So making sure I didn't leave anything out. So Buddhism first arrived in Japan in the mid-6th century. Dengyo Daishi founded the Tendai school, and Kobo Daishi founded the Shingon school. So here's some other important names. Dengyo Daishi, he lived from 762 to 822 ACE. And Kobo Daishi. Who lived from 724 to 835 ACE. Founded another major branch, which is the Shingon school. Okay. Both are honored as wise men by all branches of Japanese Buddhists, not just their own sects. And then in the Kamakura era that we mentioned that followed after that, yes, there were several Buddhist figures trained at Mount Hai. We've spoken about Honen, who founded Jodoshu, Pure Land Buddhism. He says that you got to be delivered by the grace of Amida to the Pure Land, and you could do that in one way by just passionately believing him and chanting the Nembutsu. Honen believed that perhaps if you chant this at the moment of death, that is another even more forceful way to secure your place in the Pure Land. Now, Honen had a disciple by But actually, I don't want to move on to his disciple too quickly before I say a few last things about Honen. He believed the world had entered into this kind of dark age. There's a word for that in the Japanese tradition too, and it's mappo. So mappo is this sort of, how do I have it here? A dark age at the end of the world where we've lost touch with Dharma. Okay, so Honen believed, Honen, the founder of Pure Land Buddhism, he said that he thinks we're in the Mappo phase of existence because he's living in a time where he sees a lot of civil strife and chaos in the social world, including civil wars that had been fought. So he thought that, we're in that age of Mappo that's spoken of in some Buddhist doctrines. And what it means to say that we've lost touch with Dharma. So Dharma is like kind of interpreted as a translation meaning truth, law, or principle. And we've just lost touch with the truth, with the principles that we should be living according to, with good moral law. As such, he believed that faith instead of meditation was our best hope of achieving salvation, given the fact that the world is in this kind of fallen state. Now, from the year 1207 ACE until his death, he was banished from the temple complex at Mount Hai because he departed a little bit from the more orthodox Tendai views that came before him. And he had his own kind of unique views about the pathway to salvation. So he was banished, and that meant that he had to go live on a remote island called Shikoku. During this time of his banishment and isolation, he wrote some influential works. The most notable is Senchaku Hongen Nembutsu. So let me get that here. Yeah, 1 second. Sacred persons. Okay. Senchaku Hongan Nembutsushu. So this is the Japanese title of the book that was written by Honen. And let me just give you that translation into English. In English, it just means treatise on the selection. Treatise on the selection of the Nembutsu of the primal vow. Okay, so that's a kind of lengthy title, but all it really does is it stresses the supreme importance and value of uttering this Nembutsu in order for you to achieve salvation. Eventually, after his death, the sect that he starts, the Pure Land, gains greater recognition, and Jodoshu becomes a major sect of Japanese Buddhism. Now, his legacy doesn't completely end with him because he had a disciple. He had a major follower that, was his primary, acolyte. And so this disciple of Honen is named Shinran, another, sacred and important person in the Japanese religious history. Shinran lived from, 1173 to 1263 ACE. Okay, so this was the major follower and disciple of Honen. He founded his own kind of spin-off of the Pure Land Buddhist sect called True Pure Land. So so he founded True Pure Land, and today that is the single largest sect of Japanese Buddhism. So he's definitely a major, figure for that contribution alone. He rejected the idea of priestly celibacy, which was a kind of prevailing norm in Buddhist monastic culture at the time. So he said if a person becomes a priest, they can have a family, they don't have to maintain celibacy. And that ended up making that practice change, not just in his sect, but in others in Japan too. Most important to him is total and intense personal commitment to the Amida Buddha. So he doesn't say, like his teacher Honen did, that we have to chant this all the time, the Nimbutsu. If we just do it once with sincerity and conviction, that's enough to secure our place in the Pure Land. As it says here in our textbook, what sets Shinran apart from Honen is his emphasis on what he called the primal vow, an absolute commitment to Amida Buddha as one's personal savior. Shinran held that an all-embracing, intensely personal faith in the power of the divine Amida was the key to salvation. This idea is remarkably similar to the Protestant idea of justification by faith that came 3 centuries later with Martin Luther. Ultimately, what mattered most was the relation between the believer and Amida, and ultimately, everything else was fundamentally peripheral. So it did not matter how often you recited the Nimbutsu or whether you did it just before death, as his teacher had preached. So it's just like Pure Land. It's just a little bit more focused on having the belief in and the faith in Amida Buddha, not necessarily having to adhere to other doctrines or practices or to say it at given times, the Nimbutsu. A more controversial figure in the era was Nichiren. So he lived from 1222 to 1282. Okay. And he doubted the Nimbutsu, and he thought that we should rely solely on the Lotus Sutra that was spoken of before to get to our salvation. He encouraged this different chant, Namu Myoho Renge Kyo. Namu Myoho Renge Kyo means I take my refuge in the Lotus Sutra. Okay, so that's Nichiren's motto and principle that sort of defines his creed. He rejected everything else except for trying to reveal your Buddha nature through the practice of the doctrines found in the Lotus Sutra. He rejected everything else, including the power of Amida to save the soul. So he didn't believe in this idea of the Pure Land where you just have faith in Amida Buddha and that'll kind of get you to your destination. Instead, he thought that you had to really try to awaken the Buddha nature within, follow the kind of doctrines and messages that are included in the Lotus Sutra text. In 1253, he left Mount Hiei, and he started preaching against the Pure Land branches, and that caused him to be exiled. And you see, he actually was quite unpopular during his life, because one thing about him that's sort of unique in Japanese religious history and just Japanese history generally is because he's one of the only people to stand up and say, I'm preaching the only truth. These other teachers, these other schools of Buddhism, they're wrong. They're not leading you to your salvation. You need to only listen to my version. Now that's common in Western religions and in the Abrahamic religions. People that say they're Christians say, well, we have the true faith. And if you're following, a different religious leader or a different religious view, you might end up in hell. You might not be saved, and so on. But in the Asian religious traditions and in Japan, there's this emphasis on harmony and synthesis of all these disparate ideas into one kind of cohesive whole. So for somebody to stand out and say, I'm telling you the truth, my version of Buddhism is the only authentic or legitimate one, that was a really controversial and kind of unpopular idea. But more recently, there's been a bit of a revival of interest in his writings and ideas. So they've gained more acceptance than they had during his own life. Now, a distinctive feature, so we're moving on, I guess I should say that. We're now talking about the ethical principles and doctrines of the Japanese religion. So we've gone over, I think, in some good detail, a lot of the important, historic figures, the sacred persons. So now we're going to just close whatever time we still have to talk a little bit about important ethical principles in Japanese religious traditions. So a distinctive feature of Japanese religious ethical thought is this concept of wa, okay? So I want you to know what that is. Wa, it's a complex idea, but I can give you, I think, a clear enough explanation. It refers to a kind of benign harmony that is inherent in human relationships and nature. So Okay, a benign harmony, a synergy, a non-conflict between people in society and the personal relationships we have with each other, and also with respect to our connection to the natural world and the universe. Anything that disrupts or upsets Wa is bad and should not be done. That's an ethical belief that kind of pervades Japanese thought. And it relates to the subordination of the individual to the group because rules that regulate human conduct and interaction are thought to be necessary to maintain this harmony. It's not about toxic individualism or being the main character and making everybody else submit to what you want at their expense. But the idea of Wa is that we all have to work cooperatively together, and it is the group that matters more than the individual. We should focus on and maintain the holistic health and wellness of the whole social unit rather than one individual. And if those things come into conflict, it's the group that holds sway. If we don't uphold that benign harmony among members of society, then everything will dissolve into chaos. So goes the idea. Now, those same ideas, you can maybe see a connection to Confucian thought. In Confucian thought, it is also emphasizing social harmony. And even Taoism has the notion of non-interference with nature. But in the Japanese context, Wa is an independently existing idea with ancient clan-based prehistoric roots. So the Japanese idea of Wa, although it bears significant similarities to the Chinese expressions that we find in Confucianism and Taoism, it's unique. It's something that, at least if it's not a completely different idea, it's still developed indigenously in Japan on its own. So two further concepts that are related to Wa, which are also very important to understanding Japanese ethical thinking in religion, is the idea of tatame, which means face. Tatame, face, and ie, I-E, that's all, it's the word of two letters in English anyway. And that refers to the extended household, including one's ancestors. So extended family will say, including ancestors. So when we talk about our family, we usually are talking about, the people alive. But in the Japanese cultural way of looking at things, there's also this more extensive range of relatives and people connected to your family, and there are the deceased ancestors. That's them together with the living family is the ie. Tatame means face. Now, face, not like literally this type of face, but in a more symbolic sense. Face concerns the image that you project to the outside world. And what is said, according to this concept, is that you suffer a loss of face when you fail in one of your social roles or duties. So okay, so if I was like, watching The Lighthouse and I fall asleep, and because of that, a ship crashes, everyone dies or cargo gets lost, I'm suffering a loss of face, because I failed in my social role as being, the person on guard watching for danger. And that's not the only case. Suppose that I work in a company and I commit financial fraud to benefit myself. When that gets discovered, not only have I committed a crime, so I bring disgrace to myself, but I also bring disgrace to the company and maybe to my family members because I failed in my duty or role to be, a sort of ethical and judicious member of the company. So tatame is a very important Japanese concept. The loss of face causes shame, and this upsets Wa. When you lose face, there's no longer that proper relation between the different members of society, and it doesn't promote social harmony. This shame that you can feel from a loss of face, or tatame, enforces compliance. It's a kind of mechanism that induces people to comply with the social order and what's good for the group. It enforces compliance with socially approved behavior. Now, some people criticize this notion because they think that the idea is based on shame rather than guilt. And let me make sure that you understand the difference between shame and guilt. Both involve regret, like you'll regret something that you're guilty for doing. You'll regret something that you are ashamed of doing, but there's more of a moral basis to the idea of guilt. So guilt, I'm just explaining it here in the chat. Guilt means I regret X because X was wrong morally. Okay, so that's with guilt. You have a feeling of regret. Maybe you want to make amends or somehow atone for it. But the reason is because you feel that you did something wrong. Shame, though, different. Shame is another bad feeling, a feeling of regret, but what it results from is violating a social norm or expectation, not necessarily doing anything immoral. So in this case, you would say, I regret X because X leads to ostracism or condemnation. Okay, so you can imagine feeling shame without guilt if you do something that is socially disapproved of, but it's not actually immoral. You know, suppose that you received an invitation to go to an event and you just didn't read the invitation carefully enough, but it said like all white dress code. You know, this is a white clothing party. That's the theme. And then you go like wearing just like random like black clothes or just colorful clothes, and everyone's kind of looking at you and smiling and snickering a little bit because you're out of place. You might feel shame there. You might regret it because this is going to ostracize you from the social environment. But it's not the same thing as feeling guilt. Like I don't know, you commit theft against a person, or you assault them because you were angry, or maybe you're so greedy that you steal from your neighbor. You know, in that case, you will feel regret, but not just because, oh, this is something that's impolite in polite society, or this is something that's socially awkward or whatever, but rather because it's actually wrong to do that. It's a violation of a moral principle. So some people say that the Japanese preoccupation with the concept of saving face and not, losing tatame is somehow more rooted in the experience of shame rather than guilt. I hope you can understand that criticism. So one who experiences shame rather than guilt seems to have a moral failure. Guilt means I regret it because it was wrong. Shame just means I regret it because it was something that I'll be ostracized for. Is there any reason to prefer one over the other? Well, in any case, there's a deep cultural identity with shame, avoiding shame, and the effects that can have on people. In classical terms, there's a sort of Japanese idea of ritual suicide that a person may commit if they've transgressed too badly and if their shame becomes overwhelming. It's also seen in personal expressions of shame, even in public life. So like when a train is late, in some parts of Japanese culture, all of the employees from the big CEOs down to the individual workers will issue a joint apology showing that everybody that's involved in the company's organization takes part in the mutual and communal expression of shame. Atonement can erase shame, but again, sometimes it could be self-destructive. You don't want people to hurt themselves or to consider suicide because they feel ashamed of what they've done. But again, it's not a completely foreign concept within the Japanese cultural context because of how powerful the imperative is to maintain, this kind of normative alliance with what the social expectations are. So it's an ethics that's based on subordination of the individual to the group, and shame results from violating that norm. Now, Shinto ethics peaks during the state Shinto period from 1872 to 1945. During that period of time, obedience to the emperor was one way of maintaining your social respectability and your tatame, your face. Mahayana Buddhism has the by now familiar idea of karma and rebirth. We've talked about that. So there's obviously an ethical dimension to that. You should try to always live a good way so that you build a positive balance of karma, so that you're not burdened with, further iterations of reincarnation, perhaps that'll cause you suffering and pain as you're searching for your enlightenment across many lifetimes. So since we've talked a lot about those ethical views, I don't think there's too much to add. Maybe if I can find something in the text to speak to on that point. Yeah, I'll just read it here. It says, um, so Mahayana Buddhism has a well-defined concept of inherent human wickedness, and the Buddhist ultimate goal is to achieve salvation in the form of nirvana. That means release from the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. The cycle is fueled by the accumulation of merit and demerit, the concept known as karma. In the Buddhist view, demerit springs from desire, and the loss of desire is the key to your salvation. In Mahayana Buddhism, the attainment of nirvana essentially depends on adherence to the Noble Eightfold Path. We've talked more about that in the past. From the point of view of the Pure Land schools, there are two paths to salvation. So the hard way is to lead a morally perfect life, avoid the selfishness that lies at the root of desire, and to perform good works. Also, engage in intense meditation in order to reach the state of enlightenment. In Japan, the Buddhist insistence on suppressing personal desire complements the Shinto ethical tradition that demands subordination to the group in such a way that harmonious relationships are maintained, meaning wa. So this idea of wa kind of intersects with the Japanese Buddhist viewpoint that we need to eliminate our desires. Selfishness is at the root of these desires that are spoken of in Buddhism. So there's kind of like this, again, interesting connection between seeing that and seeing the indigenous Japanese idea of wa as sort of they're aligned, they're fused, they're not at odds with each other, they kind of complement each other. The second or easier way to get that nirvana is advocated by the Pure Land sects. They think that the effort required to achieve salvation is too great for anyone living in this troubled and distracting world. It recommends professing utter faith in the Amida Buddha who will lead the soul after death to the paradise of the Pure Land. So different schools of Buddhist thought have different views about the best manner that we can achieve our own enlightenment. In some cases, it's through an intense practice of morality, the elimination of desires, meditation. To others, like in the Pure Land school, it would be better for you to just kind of place all your faith and devotion in the Amida Buddha and hope that that will get you to that same outcome, since the world itself, in their more pessimistic view, is too corrupt and chaotic, together with our perhaps flawed human nature to realistically have a great chance at it. So it's a harder way or an easier path, but not everyone agrees on the validity of either, depending on which tradition they're more involved with. So we've now talked about that, and when we come back for the next meeting that I'll post this weekend, we'll have one more on the Japanese religious traditions. We'll finish with the sacred spaces of Japanese religious traditions, the sacred times, and then death and the afterlife, as well as society and religion. So that's about one more lesson's worth of material to cover, and then after that we'll be on to the next stuff, which is considering arguments that try to make the proof, or at least case, that God exists, and we'll see if those arguments have any credibility or if they have some weaknesses or what. So thanks again, everyone. I really appreciate you tuning in. Today's lesson went a little shorter, but hopefully that's all good to you. I wish you really well, and if you need anything from me, please don't hesitate to reach out. But for now, take it easy and have a good one, and I will see you soon. Okay, bye-bye.